I was a camp counselor for 4 years at a sleepover summer camp in New England. The camp is on a lake, and the camp owns all the property around the lake, with the exception of a boat put in and one house. There are no other buildings beside the camp, and a house on the other side of the lake owned by a state trooper. When I was a counselor in training, my fellow counselors and me brought our campers to campsite about halfway around the lake. All of the campsites are on property owned by the camp. We were sleeping out there for the night. This particular site is on a decent-sized hill. So it's my 2 co-staff and me with our 15 campers. We make dinner, make s'mores, and then all go to bed around 11 p.m. The campers are all in their sleeping bags in a group closer to the fire, and me and my co-staff are side by side, in a line, with our heads pointed toward the campers and the fire. I wake up around 2 a.m. to some noise. I'm kind of groggy, but I realize it's heavy footsteps coming away from our campsite. I also hear 2 dogs panting. I remain motionless and don't make a sound. My face is down in my bedroll. I can hear the footsteps come closer and hear the dogs getting louder. My heart is beating out of my chest. I can hear the person walk past me and my co-staff, maybe 4 to 5 feet to my right, toward the campers. He stops for a few seconds. I can hear his footsteps stop, but I can still hear the dogs. He lingers there for what feels like an eternity, and then proceeds away from our campsite. I can hear the dogs, and his footsteps gradually get quieter and quieter as he moves off down the hill and toward the lake. I wake my co-staff and tell them what happened as soon as I know he is far enough away. Our fire is pretty much just embers at this point, so we decide we need to build it back up. A half hour passes. We have the fire built up now. I carve up 2 branches with my knife to make impromptu spears, just in case. We've all decided to just stay up and keep watch in case he comes back. We hear dogs howling for a few minutes, and just as my senior counselor is putting a bit of wood on the fire, we hear a distant shotgun blast. The dog's howling stops, but now it's loud whimpering. Then another shotgun blast, and then silence. We are all staring at each other in stunned disbelief. I sharpen more branches, and we all watch the horizon for the sun to come up. It was a long few hours until morning. My friend and I were on a multi-day off trail hike in some of the lower elevation mountains around central Vermont. We were coming off the ridge into the hills surrounding a little mountain village and came across a hunting camp with 2 cabins. We looked in the windows of the first cabin and saw a typical run-down hunting camp. Barely inhabitable, it was dark and dirty, and there was junk scattered everywhere. It was a complete dump. There was a large padlock on the door, not that there would have been any reason to go inside. We went over to the other cabin, just 15 or 20 feet from the first, and the door was unlocked. We don't make a habit of going inside buildings where we haven't been invited in, but something just drew us inside, and I'll never forget what we saw. The second cabin was nothing like the first, It was completely spotless and had a bright, cheerful feel with walls finished in drywall and high-quality flooring instead of rough-cut pine boards. The inside was set up like a small chapel, with maybe 7 to 10 chairs facing an altar, with a podium draped in a long silky cloth. Hanging on the wall behind the altar was a large crucifix. And this is where it got really weird. Instead of Jesus, there was an alien-like figure on the crucifix. The crucifix was well made and professionally mounted, and looked exactly like something you would see in an established Christian church, just with a silver alien instead of Jesus. As we looked around, we saw that there were quite a few other items with the identical alien figure. We took a bunch of pictures with my cheap disposable camera, but although the rest of the roll printed fine, all of the pictures that we took inside and outside of the alien chapel cabin were blank. Running into such an odd place in the middle of the woods left both of us unsettled for the next half hour or so, until we finally reached a road with some real houses on it. I've been wondering what that thing is for years. I went hiking with friends on the long trail in southern Vermont a few years back. It was intended to be a long day and a fairly difficult hike up Glastonbury Mountain. About 3 miles in, we started to find old-fashioned square iron nails left at 3 to 5 foot intervals along the trail. The nails continued for about a half a mile, until they ended at a fairly large and old beech tree, impaled with hundreds of these same nails. The nails were pounded in from the roots to about 7 feet up. It looked like a pincushion with hundreds of pins. There was something about the way the tree looked, the relative silence of the woods, and the empty trail that was very unsettling. The whole thing might have just been an attempt at an Andy Goldworthy-style art, but it just had a creepy, ritualistic feel about it. We didn't end up making the summit. We turned around and went back to the car about 15 minutes later. This trail normally has a decent amount of hikers, though the area itself is entirely uninhabited. What was weird about it was how unsettling it was for all 5 of us. It still creeps me out thinking about it. This happened a few years ago in August, in a small town in northern Connecticut called Ellington. A childhood friend of mine and I were both working security at a club a few miles away, and we would occasionally hang out for a bit after knocking off for the night. One night around 2 a.m., we decided to take a walk around the farm property across the street from my buddy's place. We'd done this 1,000 times over the years. Didn't think anything of it. So we're just strolling across a field, just chatting. Maybe 20 yards from the tree line, where this field quickly turns into a swamp, when this sound erupts out of the woods, stopping us cold. I've been hiking around this area most of my life, and I've never heard anything like this. Instantly, all the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a tough sound to describe, but basically a very deep, bass woofing, wheezing. Almost sounded like a gigantic engine trying but failing to turn over, but less mechanical and more organic sounding. I've seen some decently large white-tailed deer in that area, but this sound was so loud and deep, I felt it in my chest. We've both searched for recordings of deer that come anywhere close to what we heard, and have never found anything. We turned around immediately and hoofed it out of there. I'm sure that sound has a perfectly reasonable, natural explanation, but I've yet to find it. That's easily the most frightened I've been in my adult life. I live in northern Maine, and there's a lot of scary stuff that happens up here. About 150 years ago, there was a serial killer who was a Canadian man of the name Jim Collins. He was lynched by a mob of people, and they hated him so much, everybody stuck pins in his body after he was hung. They then went on to bury him in the swamp. This is a 40-minute walk from my house. I was 12 years old when I went hiking out in the forest with my brother. We eventually came across this extremely old shack. Never seen it before, and we always play down in the forest. And not knowing the stories and being quite innocent, we just went inside. The building was probably 9 feet by 9 feet. Inside, there were a lot of old axes that were rusted. Everything else was covered by moss. There were also dead dogs and cats all over the place, clearly murdered and dissected. I'm kind of getting sick just thinking about it. Anyway, all of a sudden we hear knocking from underneath us, and we hear what sounded like, "Run!" Being young, we panic and freak out, and run as fast as our legs would get us back home. Got back to our house and told our parents what we found. It really bothered my dad, so we contacted the police to figure out what was going on in that area. When the police showed up shortly after my dad's call, they apparently caught a bunch of satanic people performing a ritual. Apparently, it was a place where the satanic group, who was mostly 20 to 30-year-olds, would go to sacrifice animals. They say they could feel the evil energy from the man who died there. What's crazy is I found out as I got older that the last person Jim Collins ever murdered, he killed with an axe, only after he yelled at the guy outside to run, while slapping the floor. Apparently they were police officers too, with the sheriff and the deputy was the one who got away, running through that same exact forest. Anyways, apparently the group who was performing the rituals only got there less than 10 minutes after we left. So yeah, I don't even want to know what might have happened if we stayed. I wish I had pictures of the places, but the city had to demolish them shortly after the incident.